Do you need a web application security solution that can improve your detection rate and enable easier remediation? Acunetics has a fully automated solution that can detect and report over 4,500 web vulnerabilities. Fast and scalable, it can scan thousands of pages without interruption, including HTML5, JavaScript, and single-page applications. Acunetics provides accuracy with the lowest false positives by combining black box and white box testing. For more information, visit acunetics.com/Security Weekly.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Paul Asadoorian. RSA Conference 2019 is the place to be. From March 4th to 8th, San Francisco will come alive with cybersecurity's brightest minds as they gather together to discuss the industry's newest developments. Go to rsaconference.com/Security Weekly-US19 to register now using the discount code 5U9SWFD to receive $100 off a full conference pass. Security Weekly will be in Broadcast Alley on Monday and Tuesday of RSA Conference. To learn more or request time with us, please visit securityweekly.com/conference request. And we've gotten a lot of requests. I think we're up over 50 requests, Paul, for either briefings or interviews at RSA this year. So you and I have some work to do over the next couple of weeks to kind of lock in our final choices.
For sure.
Yeah. All right, let's start with the news. So the first article, Paul, I had is Android vulnerability lets hackers wreak havoc using a PNG file.
Yeah, so this one's interesting, Matt, because when I first started reading it, the details were really light. Although I think it was some folks on Twitter or somewhere had messaged me because I was questioning, is it just I load an image in my browser and then the browser is calling some kind of vulnerable library inside of Android? That appears to be the case. Or you could get it via SMS, and the SMS app would render it and then also be exploitable as well. So there's a few different attack vectors for this, which are actually kind of scary because all you have to do is load an image. And these have been scary vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it was embedding the malicious code in the image, and all you had to do was render the image to actually execute that malicious code, which I thought was kind of scary.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that stems from there's so much I think you look at images and think, oh, it's just a blob of data that gets rendered as an image. However, inside of, if you look at the various image file formats, there's all kinds of other fields in there for all kinds of other things, including some potential places to put code, sometimes in different file formats on purpose, right? We look at Word macros and other such things. So images aren't really images anymore. And there's also metadata, in those images that could also be parsed and processed. So there's a lot going on when your device, whatever it is, renders an image. And those are some of the more scary vulnerabilities for me, right? Because to get someone, you just got to get them to render an image, and that can be pretty easy.
Yeah, it's pretty easy. Yeah. Teenager hackers evil app steals Apple Mac passwords. This looks like another bug in FaceTime, I think, that was allowing the ability to steal iPhone and Mac users' passwords.
Yeah, and iOS has been pretty good about providing a more secure environment that I think a lot of other mobile platforms have. However, they've had a series of vulnerabilities recently that makes you kind of question that. But I think what's also concerning for the security community is just how little information about anything security related Apple is willing to talk about publicly. And that's been since the beginning of time. I remember when we first started the show, it was Dave Maynor that had found some vulnerabilities in the Wi-Fi chipsets. And when you looked at how Apple was responding to that, it's pretty consistent. I mean, I think they do work much better with security researchers today, but you don't get a lot of information, which makes us suspicious. Like, what are you trying to hide, right?
Yeah, they had this issue with, was it the FaceTime? Yeah, it was the group FaceTime app a couple weeks back. So this is yet another FaceTime bug, but you're right. They have not disclosed a lot publicly about any of their security issues. They kind of brush it under the rug. They get a patch out, they push out the patch, and okay, all done, taken care of.
Yeah, and I give Microsoft a lot of credit because they have been instrumental in a lot of areas in the security community. They released their own threat modeling model, right? Um, they have published how they do secure software development and really been leaders in that field. And so Microsoft has shared and been, which is really weird to say, a lot more open, right?
Right.
And therefore, there's a level of trust, and I think their process and Microsoft doesn't always fix it, right? And again, they're pretty transparent. They're like, yeah, we're not going to fix it. Like here's roughly why. We may fix it in the future. But for most major bugs, Microsoft's like, nope, we're fixing this one. They at Blue Hat recently, Microsoft was talking about how most of the vulnerabilities, I believe it was specific to Windows, something like 79% are all memory related bugs, largely because untype safe or unsafe languages like C and C++ is what Windows is written in. Therefore, you're going to have a high, probability of that. But Microsoft was open about talking about that and doing the research and publishing it and sharing it with the community. You don't see that from Apple, and we cover the vulnerabilities all the time, and they're behind this like iron curtain, right? It's like, what is going on? We don't know.
Well, I think Microsoft got beat up years ago.
They did.
On aspects of this, right? And then they implemented Patch Tuesday, and they became much more transparent with what they're doing, how they're doing it, how they're fixing it. And now there's standardized processes in place. Everybody knows when Patch Tuesday comes out, okay, here come a bunch of fixes for all these vulnerabilities. They've made it a very open kind of policy and procedure that everybody now knows. Apple hasn't gone there yet, maybe because they haven't received the same type of pressure that Microsoft did in the early days.
Yeah, and for fundamental architectural issues like we've seen with Microsoft, for example, right? I mean, these are just fundamental ways in which Active Directory works. It can be abused. If they're not fixing it, they're planning on a feature in a lot of cases that in the future it'll be fixed, and they're offering up plenty of workarounds to do that. I don't see Apple having that level of commitment to application or operating system security.
Not yet.
Not yet. Until they're put in a similar position like Microsoft was in, particularly 2003 was one of the big turning points, right? When there was all those worms running around destroying people's networks in large swaths of the internet.
Yes. Talking about destroying stuff.
Oh yeah.
Are you familiar with VF email?
I was not until I started reading about it this week, which is apparently they had a breach. I didn't see any details about the breach, and I was unclear as to the motives of why someone would essentially hack into VF email, which was supposed to be this, private kind of email service. They promoted privacy and confidentiality and all that stuff, but someone just started wiping stuff off their servers, like hardcore wiping out backups, wiping out VMs, the whole thing. It kind of made me think, how can we be more resilient to attacks like this when the motive is like search and destroy, right?
Yeah,
typically the motive of an attacker is to profit in some way, right? They might steal the information, they might ransomware it, they might sell you, looking to collect your intellectual prop, whatever this motive was clearly on a path of destruction. And I think we need to do a better job of threat modeling that, not just in our security infrastructure, right? This is Application Security Weekly, but putting your evil hat on and looking inside your application and go, what if someone was on a search and destroy mission? What safeguards would we have in place inside the application? And then also in this case, when you saw like how deep they were going, how do you have a backup plan that doesn't allow a malicious actor or makes it difficult for them to get at those backups?
I think one of the challenges I see now with cloud computing and putting everything in the cloud is the whole aspect of the recovery domain. I don't think we think as much about backup restore like we used to in the data center, because we're thinking, oh, well, I have another instance running over here, so I have resiliency. I don't really need to think about backup restore. But when you're dealing with a destructive attack, and their purpose is to go destroy this stuff, not just take it down, but I mean literally wipe the data out. Backup and recovery is an important component now. And I don't think we talk enough about it nowadays because we just think, well, I just shut that instance down. I'll spin up this one and we're all good to go. No, it doesn't work in this particular case. And I think that's the big takeaway for me on this one is I think we kind of forgot about backup and recovery a little bit in the cloud world. And this is a good example of why you still need it.
And we've talked about a lot of technologies that we'd use to secure our new environments in containers and microservices and serverless, right? But what we haven't talked about is when we define those trust relationships, how do we have a one-way connection or relationship where I take a backup and it can only go to the backup point, wherever that is, right? And I can't overwrite that backup. Like I can only serially write to somewhere, and I can't go retrieve that without some kind of safeguard. And, there's technologies to do that in the infrastructure and core of your networks, but I don't understand how that's done. I'm sure there's solutions available for it, right? How is that done when you're out in the cloud and containers and all of that, and to have that backup that can be preserved and have some controls around it?
Yeah, I think that's an important lesson out of this story.
Yeah, for sure.
620 million accounts stolen from 16 hacked websites now for sale on dark web, seller boasts.
Yeah, I think, this is a trend we've been seeing, and I'm not sure. This is a newer one. And there was one that I think we covered last week or the week before. And, a lot of this is happening on the dark web, and I think a lot of it's being sensationalized. A lot of it, when like Brian Krebs and other investigative journalists dig into it, a lot of this is older data. And I think they're using it as kind of like a hook. Like if they feel like they want to trust you, they could say, well, yeah, the one that's getting all the press right now, and this happened, I think, last week, the one's in the press with all these hundreds of millions are like, that one's kind of old. I got this newer one, by the way, that wasn't out there that's much more recent data that I'll sell you for more money, and it's more accurate, maybe less credentials, but more recent. And so there's, I think, a huge marketplace, of course, that is centered around credentials and being bought, sold, and traded on the dark web. And, it's unfortunate that people's credentials are out there, but you got to dig into the details.
I looked at the apps, and I'm like, okay, I've never used any of these, so my stuff's fine.
Yep.
Luckily. I want to skip over to 15 million patient records breached in 2018. Kind of on the lines of the last article, we are seeing an increase, and I think they said it's a tripled from 2017, the number of patient records breached in 2018. And I think this is a big area of concern for a lot of people, people getting into patient records. There's a lot of information in the patient records beyond just financial data, obviously, that could be used against somebody. This is a little scary for me because, there's a lot of sensitive data in certain patient records.
So I'm trying to pull it up. My mouse doesn't like me today. If I scroll down, it was Connie blah 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 Mastovich. I always get their name wrong. Yeah, from Reclamier, InfoSec World Speaker. We were talking about the dark web. We started talking about patient records, and I was like, I don't understand why they're so popular. And she went into 3 or 4 different ways that you can monetize a patient record, and there's all sorts of creative ways that I had never considered before. And she was like, well, firstly, you can ransom the person who holds those records. Maybe there's some kind of sensitive data about your health records that you don't want your employer or anyone else to know about, right? So there's one method. The second method is prescriptions, right? If that health record is tied to prescriptions, you can, as an attacker, basically commit fraud to receive those prescriptions and then sell those prescriptions on your dark web account. And then the third way was some kind of insurance fraud is also possible. Also, some of the health patient records could gain you access to some type of payment system as well. So there's kind of credit card fraud kind of thrown in there as well. So there's all these different schemes that attackers have come up with to monetize patient records, and it's driven the price up of a health record on the dark web tremendously because you've got lots of options on how you can monetize them, which is really, really slimy, in my opinion.
It is. Yeah, and we saw a little uptick in this a few years ago, but when I saw this, I'm like, wow, we've tripled. So, and we know the hospitals don't have a lot of funding necessarily sometimes.
Sure.
There's a lot of ways potentially into some of these systems in the hospitals. There's a ton of telemetry devices. We talked about, the industrial IoT and the potential vulnerabilities there. There's a lot of these types of sensors in the network. They're connected to the main network. There's a lot of different attack vectors in a hospital to go after some of this data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very scary. Should I cover the PCI article for Jeff?
Yeah, for Jeff. Yeah, what is they have new software? What does that mean?
Yeah, they're coming out with 2 new software standards to replace the old payment application data security standard. So when PCI came out originally with the data security standard, they then followed up with an application specific one for payment card systems. This is 2 new standards that are going to replace the PA-DSS by 2022. The first one's called the PCI Secure Software Standard, which outlines the different security requirements, and then the PCI Secure SLC Standard, which is for the software lifecycle. And we talked a little bit about DevOps, but it's about the different components to secure the software lifecycle. So these 2 new standards will replace what was traditionally the Payment Application Data Security Standard.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. You might, Jeff might bring it up tonight on PSW. Or something.
I'm pretty sure that he probably will.
This article I liked a lot because it ties into the interview segment, which is how shifting security left speeds development. And it's all about finding security issues sooner in the pipeline, in the DevOps pipeline, to get that fixed. And so the much more secure code comes out the other end. And this is a lot of what we talked about in the last segment with Gurpreet, which is that integration of security into the DevOps process, doing checks along the way. And by doing that, you're going to get more secure and faster code out the other end.
It's interesting when I think about having good infrastructure and a good process and how that leads to good security. This is definitely it. And I think a lot we can sit here as, security pundits and say we should shift left and we should, fix all these vulnerabilities sooner. But I think there's a lot of factors that go into how to create resilient software that actually works and meets requirements, right? And I think a lot of it starts with having good design requirements is one thing that kind of comes to mind, and having a good foundation. It's something we'll talk about in our webcast today with ExtraHop, right? Having a good foundation allows you to build and use more advanced tools to do threat hunting and find other anomalous events a lot more easily. And I think that also lends itself to software in that when I am going to create software, if I have really well-defined requirements, I've done some really good threat modeling. When I go to write my code, I'm having a much easier time writing it to spec. Therefore, I can include additional controls and components that allow me to be more secure and allow me to fix any problems much more quickly. So I think a lot of this, shifting left is not just fixing bugs. It's more about having a really good process in my mind.
Agreed. And I think that is the vision of DevSecOps, which is a really tight process that includes all these components. And that's going to give you more secure, better code out the other end. And we still see these as 2 separate components in a lot of places. There are some really good examples of organizations that have embraced the integration of security into the process, but there's still a lot of organizations, security still at the end of the release cycle, and at that point it's too late, and that we need to continue to see that better integration back to the left with the rest of the development staff.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it, one of the things that when you read the Phoenix Project, and especially beyond the Phoenix Project, that really I find myself referring back to is that concept of you have to have all the parts, before you send something through the assembly line. And that's why I kind of went back to having all the requirements. Those are the parts that you need, right? It's not you're not manufacturing a car, you're manufacturing software. One of the things you need is all of those requirements to be laid out in the beginning, and you're going to have a much easier time building software securely if you have that.
Yes, absolutely. The last article I want to cover is this Microsoft article on the perils of using Internet Explorer as your default browser. And he gets into some very interesting discussions about the default settings in IE that go back to way back to IE 6, and not, to keep compatibility, we're letting this default browser setting take us all the way back to IE 6 type settings. I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and I question how much a browser should, or is able to render pages correctly through various applications, right? I mean, the thing that got us in trouble years ago with IE6 was applications didn't work in any other browser. I think it's gotten better. However, I think there's been a lot of evolutions of browsers, and I don't know how much this relates to application security, but certainly, from having a secure browser perspective for general users, it's really frustrating because what's in my mind happening is we had very early browsers, right? Microsoft wanted to get in the browser mix. There was a lot of browser wars, right, that were fought years ago. But we'd find the latest browser in like Firefox or Mozilla, and we're like, oh, I really like that. And then as development went on, there were flaws, there were performance issues, there were other types of issues, with the browser. And then we're like, we need something new. And so Google's like, oh, we have Chrome. Now I feel like Chrome's going down the same damn path. Like Chrome now is just like a resource hog, and you've got all of these vulnerabilities with their add-ons. Add-ons are great, right? They give users extra functionality. A lot of times that functionality is security related, but now people are poisoning the water hole with add-ons. So what's, the next thing? One browser I like on my phone that I wish they had for the desktop is Firefox Focus. So it blocks automatically all your ads and trackers and all that stuff, and you can put it on your mobile devices. I'm like, can I get that for my desktop? I'm not sure. I haven't done any significant research to see, how that might be accomplished on the desktop side. Of course, we've got Firefox Quantum, which people are saying is really good. I've been dabbling a little bit in Firefox, but it comes down to a convenience thing, as security always does with applications or any type of security. And that is, Chrome's tied to your Google accounts. And if you're like me and you have multiple Google accounts, everything travels with you. And yes, it's password protected, but that password doesn't really protect you if it gets in the hands, your data gets in the hands of attackers. It's very easily cracked. At least it was as of a couple of years ago. So
that's why we use Authenticator as our second token to make sure we got at least two-factor on it.
Yeah, and so I'm not sure how I think if someone has access to your system and steals the files and doesn't have your Google login, they can still unlock like your browser history and bookmarks and things like that. Because it's a separate password. So when I log into a new version of Chrome, it asks me to authenticate. I two-factor right through LastPass is what I use, and then it has me enter another password to unlock my browser history and bookmarks that follow me along, and that's to basically decrypt my settings. But that, at least of a couple of years ago, was implemented pretty terribly. I remember Larry saying he had problems, had to restore a laptop, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I just ran this tool and I unlocked my all my history." So that has me concerned. And I'm sure there's probably plugins for Firefox to accomplish that kind of thing. But the browser thing is really, really interesting.
Yeah, especially with what they announced, IE 11 end of life. There's probably still IE 7 and 10 hanging out there.
Yeah,
and all this backwards compatibility modes just not helping.
They're moving to the Chrome engine, is what I read a few weeks ago. That's their next evolution.
Getting out of the... I can't. What's the new one? It's called
Edge.
Yeah, Edge. As
It's
soon as that
awful.
came out on like Windows 8, I'm like, I'm done.
It's
I'm done.
awful.
I got rid of all my Windows devices.
Yep,
Done.
pretty much.
All right, that's the news for this week. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.